everybody. My name is Emily Kimani, and I am your UASU VP Operations and Finance. Welcome to In Conversation With. This is a segment where we talk about the Black experiences and the different aspects that make up our experiences. Today, I am joined by Gatera and Petros Kusmu, and today we are going to talk about Black masculinity. Hello, Petros. Hello, Ian. Thank you so much for joining me today. Before we start, do you want to introduce yourself, give me a little spiel about who you are? Ian,
Sure, I can start. My name's Ian. I am a former U Alberta student. I actually was on student council the year before Emily became VP Finance. Kind of wish we had an overlapping time there, but I studied biology, minored in sociology. I guess a bit more about me personally. I'm originally from Rwanda, but I've been in Edmonton for about the last 12 years. Youngest of four, I don't know, lots of different things. Right now I'm kind of just navigating that post-graduation life, ideally hoping to enter a healthcare type job sometime soon.
Cool, thanks for that, Petros.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Petros, dialing in from Vancouver, also known as the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I am also a former U Alberta grad, much older than you two, but I studied economics, political science, was on Students' Council for far too long, and also was an executive at the Students' Union at the U of A. Born and raised largely in Edmonton, and spent a good chunk of my teenage years in Eritrea, Northeast Africa. Returned, and after graduation, went to grad school abroad and lived in Calgary. Now I've been in Vancouver for the past 3 years doing public sector management consulting. So that's a little bit about me.
Cool. Thank you so much for introducing yourself. So let's just dive into this conversation. And the first question I'll ask you both is, what does Black masculinity mean for you? So a very general question, but I think this is a good place to start. Any one of you could start.
I'll pass it to Ian first.
Sure.
Because it's a daunting question.
Yeah, this is kind of a loaded question. But I will say, I feel like my ability to articulate a lot of things related to race and now this conversation was really helped by my sociology degree, because a lot of my experiences I wasn't able to kind of put in the context of theories and words and all this stuff, and just learning about how race is a construct, right? And how a lot of ideas, whether it's stereotypes about Black people, Black men specifically, a lot of them were constructed for a reason, whether that was slavery, dehumanizing people so they can be used for labor, etc. So when I think of Black masculinity, the first thing I think of is those stereotypes of things, that the very two-dimensional things that have been constructed about Black men, whether that's that we're threatening, we're aggressive, basically all the negative stereotypes that are attached to that. But then when I think of it more as an experience, I think of it as, at least based on my experience, it's growing up and knowing what people in society kind of subconsciously and sometimes actively think about Black men, and kind of finding your place within that, whether that's sometimes trying to counteract those stereotypes, or sometimes feeling the pressure to live up to certain really restrictive stereotypes, whether that's hypermasculinity and other type of things. So it's kind of a mixed bag. I see it in different ways. I also was kind of reading up on this topic, Black masculinity, when I knew we were going to be doing this talk, and I see some people also describe it as a performance in the same way that other things in society are, whether that's just masculinity in general and all these very very gendered, very strict roles that we see in society. So yeah, that's kind of my, the way I see it in my head is it's complex experience, but in a lot of ways, it's also just finding your place within these like labels and ideas that you're being told, and you grow up seeing Black men being represented and depicted as, and kind of finding your place within that.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that Ian is here today as the sociology graduate that he is, because, and I wanted to at some point add the disclaimer here that by no means am I a scholar on the topic, nor have I really extensively studied it. So I'm grateful, Ian, that you all, I mean, so, you know, presumably you've maybe covered at least these, you know, you've like read some scholarly material here. Whereas for me, it's just speaking strictly from lived experience and whatever I can kind of remember from various books and talks that may have been insightful on the topic. Disclaimer out of the way. So yeah, anyways, all to say, not really much to add to what Ian had mentioned. And this is a topic that, you know, obviously before this, I was reading, thinking about it, and still struggling to kind of wrap my arms fully around this topic. It's in its entirety. So the other disclaimer here is, you know, today is, like, as you kind of mentioned, Emily, I hope it's more of just like a really fun discussion that also happens to be recorded. You know what I mean? Like if we're all just hanging out at a coffee shop or a bar, maybe at Rat. And but in either case, yeah, I think Black masculinity, trying to just, like, what is masculinity? Masculinity is, I am going to butcher this definition, it's like societal norms for how so-called men should behave, and Black masculinity adds that element of how do Black men behave. So at its simplest and most rudimentary, for those who are listening and trying to just understand it, it's that. And I think, you know, how are Black men usually portrayed through culture? How are Black men usually portrayed or kind of influenced by institutions? You know, typically it has not been in the most positive behaviors, I guess you could say, and growing up as you know, as Black men, like that's something that you kind of have to reconcile with, such that if you aren't careful with what you consume, you can just consume these really bad images, such that it kind of that can kind of have detrimental impacts. I guess all to say, I mean, we'll kind of unpack that a little bit more, but at its most rudimentary, that's how I understand what Black masculinity means. I don't know what Black masculinity should be. I think that's something I struggle with. Like if someone says, okay, we understand what Black masculinity is. It's these societal norms about how Black men should behave. What should it be? And I don't know. And I say that because I struggle with the topic of like masculinity. So what is masculinity? Like what should be positive masculinity? Well, someone who's caring, who's, you know, strength, all this, like that kind of applies though generally to everyone else. Like, you know what I mean? Like why?
Yeah.
Like why is it reserved for you know, males? And then why is it just reserved for Black folks, right? So I think that's where my head starts to like, I'm like, okay, I can't, my knowledge is just like far too limited.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, like I don't really know what to say on what future state should be. It's easier to kind of just comment on current state and history. But anyways, I'll give you a chance to proceed with the interview questions.
Yeah, and Petros, you touched on a really interesting thing. I wonder, like, even when you talk about like Black femininity, like, should that have a specific definition? You know what I'm saying? Like, should Black masculinity have like a specific definition? Should we all fit into these boxes? And obviously, I think like during this conversation, we'll kind of unpack that and realize like, no, but I think there's all these pressures from within our own community, within like society as a whole, that pressure us into fitting these little check boxes. And that brings me to my next question of how have you seen Black masculinity being depicted, you know, in general and specifically within the Black community?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the two questions of Black femininity and depictions of Black masculinity. You know, again, I don't know what Black femininity should be, but in terms of how it's typically portrayed, you know, it's through the lens of kind of patriarchy and systemic racism. Because when we Black, you know, the stereotype of Black femininity is like angry, hypersexualized Black woman, right?
Yeah.
So that is, I think, the if and I can't comment about what it feels like to be on the receiving end of what culture and institutions and norms tell you how a Black woman should be. I can't speak to that, but from what I sense, it's all of those things of kind of like angry, it's hypersexualized, etc. What it should be is another discussion that I'm not really intelligent enough to kind of get into. Now, the other question you had on how is Black masculinity depicted, you know, it's funny. I think it's drastically has changed over time, and it's interesting that the two of you are younger. So I'm curious about you. I'm not like that much older, but I'm like older, right? So so in terms of like the media and the culture that we've consumed, there is like overlap, but there's also difference. So I mean, speaking just from my own experience as someone who's in their, you know, who's what, 32. God, it feels just you guys are like 25. In either case,
You look like 23, Max.
Oh,
Just
do
gonna
I?
say, yeah.
you know, I should have shaved, and I would have fooled you even more. But in terms of like what Black masculinity was primarily depicted when I was growing up, like, you know, the pinnacle of Black masculinity that was often kind of regarded or depicted was like through the prism of like hip hop music, right? Through sports, it was primarily like 50 Cent. It was like Kobe Bryant. It was just like these Black men who were seen as like very strong, very typically athletic, very like hard, you know, like emotionally like tough, you know, very like calloused, right? That was effectively what like was depicted as kind of like the pinnacle of Black masculinity when I was a teenager growing up. And the challenge with that is, if you're anything but those things, like me, I was not super athletic. You know, I skateboarded. There's not like, you know, a Black Tony Hawk that was really popular, right? So, yeah, exactly. I didn't rap, so I played guitar. You know, I had to find my own like heroes like Jimi Hendrix to connect with, to kind of feel like, oh no, I'm still like a man. Like, you know, when you're a teenager, you still think about that, right? I wasn't really like tall or buff, right? I was just like a skinny kid. I'm a Cancer, so I like to think I'm emotionally like sensitive and in tune. So there's all these things that I just growing up, I didn't feel like I quite hit the check mark, the checkbox on, which when you're a kid, it's kind of like scary, because what happens is if you don't fall into what is like the generally accepted ideal or mold of Black masculinity, then you make yourself a target effectively for violence, i.e. bullying, right? If you aren't seen as like the hyper masculine, super talented athlete, then it just it's easy pickings for just bullying. And it's funny, you know, this Black masculinity means different things in different cultures, but I was growing up in Africa for my teenage years in a primarily Black place. So it's interesting how that still continued. To be fair, I was at an international school, so you still have like a very Western societal norms there, and even the content we consumed is very much like MTV and what have you. But all to say that those were the depictions of Black masculinity, and in my own lifetime, it's interesting to have seen it evolve, right? Because I remember going to university, and you'd see like backpack rappers were a thing. Like Kanye West was picking up, like Lupe Fiasco was picking, like just dudes who are like don't fit the mold, and stuff like that kind of was like really interesting for me. I remember thinking, oh, that's cool. They're like nerds. Like Lupe Fiasco's a skateboarder. I can identify with that. Like I can feel a little bit more comfortable in my own skin and in gender identity, right? And then Barack Obama, he was like the very intellectual, like stoic, very like family man. Those were the kind of values ascribed to him, and that was also seen as like a new form of Black masculinity as well, of like the person who can just be that intellectual, be passionate about public service, not necessarily. I mean, he was kind of athletic, but he was like a scrawny dude who like that was him, who wasn't particularly musically gifted or something like that. I don't know. um and that helped. All of those things of just having different forms of mass culture and media depicting Black masculinity, I would say helped and kind of helped shape me. And fortunately, I did, I had a pretty healthy childhood growing up, which I think prevented me from having toxic traits and behaviors for the most part, that's typically associated with toxic masculinity. And but if I didn't, then I think I would have been a very different person. So, anyways, those are that was just kind of my experience of how I saw Black masculinity evolve over time, and how that impacted my own ability to kind of confidently walk in the world and do some of the things that I did. But I'm curious, Ian, just like you're a bit younger. I don't want to presume your age too much, but like, what was it? I mean, I feel like when you were coming of age, depictions of Black men and masculinity was kind of evolving. It's not fully evolved.
Yeah, I
but
definitely would say so.
yeah, what was that like?
For me, so like when I was younger, like I said, I was born in Rwanda, so and I've definitely noticed, like when you touched on being in like a majority Black community, right? So you're like, there is still the influence, obviously, of colorism, racism, that's going to be everywhere, based on history in the world. But you get to exist a little bit without like Black being the like driving force to everything, without that being something that you're reminded of every day. And I definitely noticed the difference the first time I got here. It's just like every day you're reminded that there's a standard you're being compared to. It's like, hey, do you play basketball? Like, hey, and then it's like also the thing I always find interesting too is that like being Black, and it's like there's a negative stereotypes, but there's like the overly positive ones that like make it really cool, like having that Black friend, which makes it even more kind of performative. It's like people expect you to behave a certain way. They like want to be around you to hear you say the N-word, like stuff like that. Like, but I guess back to like representations and what I saw, kind of agree with you. Like a lot of when I was growing up, like I'm the youngest of four, so a lot of the media I consumed was like influenced by my oldest siblings, who are like 5 to 7 years older. So probably saw a lot of the same media when they were teenagers that you did, I would say. And I don't know, yeah, like I feel like things were definitely more limited. Like when I think back to like, for example, with entertainment, people that kind of caught my eye were like Michael Jackson or Andre 3000, like people that kind of didn't fit the mold of like the super hyper masculine. They kind of just like went for it in terms of like the fashion, like everything they express themselves with. So those are things like I kind of related to. And I also feel like as I've grown up, we've seen it evolve more. Like kind of rappers that and artists that I really liked were like Kid Cudi. I really like Tyler the Creator. Frank Ocean is also kind of seen as like a groundbreaking like figure in terms of showing like the vulnerability in Black men on a more like, I guess, popular level because of how well known he is. But yeah, it's kind of interesting too. I feel like with all these like new forms of Black masculinity that have evolved and come out, like even with Barack Obama, and then the kind of issues in the conversation that came after that with the whole like idea of like Black exceptionalism, or like it's like in a way things are evolving, but it's still very like two-dimensional. It's like, okay, so you're not the thug, so you're like the really smart, like the Barack Obama. You're like, there's not much. It's like you don't get to just exist. There's still like, okay, so you had like 3 options of what you could be. Let's add 1 this year. It's not like you're still being compared to a standard. You're still being like, you still have this like sort of pressure to fit some sort of mold instead of just kind of like fall into it, just because one, there's limited representations and you don't know which one you fall into, and you might not fall into any. I kind of relate to what you talked about too. Like growing up, I wasn't the most masculine, and still I'm not. And like, just like feeling that pressure of like, oh, I got to be a little bit athletic. And then like, I found myself to be a lot more artistic in a sense, right? So finding like being affirmed in that, being comfortable with that took a while. Like I would still, force myself to do, not force, but I still felt this like pressure to try things that were expected of me versus just to kind of exist and naturally enjoy the things that I did like. So it's just kind of been an interesting experience too. But I definitely do think in terms of like media specifically, we do see it evolving. But I still, like, I don't know, not to be like the Debbie Downer or negative or whatever, but I still see it as like, there's still this level of it being kind of dehumanized in a way. Just how Black people are depicted still, like, even for example, during last year when everything was going on with Black Lives Matter kind of like taking everyone's attention and everything really being at its height, it was kind of a tricky time, because then all you're intaking, especially as like a Black man, is you're seeing images of Black men being brutalized and killed, right? And to the point where it's like, these images are important to bring attention to it, but then it can become dehumanizing in a way, because it's like, you don't really get to see as many images of us just existing. Like, it's always just like something really heightened. It's like either Black men as being depicted as thugs, criminals, or being literally killed by police, or them as these like exceptional basketball players or rappers. It's like, you just don't get to see the average Black man just existing. And that's why things like the idea of like Black boy joy and stuff like that, like within the Black community, I feel like that's a thing that a lot of people like to like push for and see, is that to some extent it can be very tiring and exhausting to like go on social media and all you're seeing is Black men being killed, like I said before, and you just kind of, I don't know, there's a certain level of humanity that's still missing, I feel like, in a lot of representations. And to be fair, there has been, like when I was looking into this topic as well, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Moonlight, but that came up in a lot of conversations I was seeing, and that movie was really good. And I feel like it was kind of groundbreaking and depicting like a certain like vulnerability for Black men on like the big screen that hasn't really been seen before. So things are progressing, and like I do see like a lot of depictions that feel a lot more human and feel a lot more like grounded and not very like, I can't find a better term for it, but sometimes it feels like trauma porn, if that makes sense. It's like the world kind of just like making use of and gain off of like Black people's pain and like the culture that's come out of the pain. But more and more, it's nice to kind of see representations of just Black people existing. Like even talk to my sister. I don't know if you guys have seen the show Insecure by Issa Rae. I love that show. It's just like, it's literally just Black people existing once again, just like in their relationships, in their different representations, and just the idea that like being Black comes in such a multitude of ways. It's just refreshing to see those representations, and I feel like those have been pretty recent. So I guess that's a sign that things are evolving, but there's still conversations to be had for sure.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's no intersections in those depictions, right? Like you must be one or the other. You must be LeBron James or Kanye West or Obama. Like, and those three cannot exist in like one person, which must be exhausting trying to fit into a certain mold. And so have you tried to counteract those stereotypes, or do you find yourself kind of code switching to fit a certain stereotype or counteract that in certain spaces or environments? Loaded question, so
Yeah.
time.
I feel like, yeah, I feel like this is something that like whether you like actively are trying to like counteract these stereotypes or not live up to them, or whether it's subconscious, I feel like it's something that's always going to follow you around as a Black man. It's definitely gone through stages, whereas like as a kid, I was like, you know, I'm tall. I'm being reminded every day, like, why aren't you playing basketball? So then it's like, I feel the pressure. I'm like, yo, like I told my big brother, like he's a great basketball player, great athlete in general. Both my brothers, and like just telling them like, yo, let's go train. You know, I never got any better because I didn't have a real interest in it. I just felt like, you know, you've been given this like God-given talent that you're like tall and Black. So like you got to use it for this one thing that you've been told you're supposed to be using it for. So I feel like as a kid, it was a very conscious, like active thing of trying to find my place in it and trying to fit the molds that I've been told. Now it's I feel like subconsciously we still do it, especially like when you talk about the professional world and like, you know, when you go into like academia and different things, like the influence of white people in positions that like of power, whether it's like people that are hiring you, people in academia, like professors, like I feel like you still kind of start to like code switch, right? Like whether to like play up certain parts of yourself or underplay parts of yourself that may be too Black or too this. So I feel like as much as I've developed and kind of try to grow out of that, there's still that level of always comparing myself to that standard and figuring out like how to act in certain spaces. One thing that's been interesting over the pandemic too is like growing my hair out, you know, like as like growing up as a kid, it's always been like, get your hair cut because it looks neat and looks like just professional, which that in itself is kind of like how, like, it's its own conversation about race. Is like, how does the way people's hair naturally grows out of their head, like how is that unprofessional? But yeah, so growing it out now has been an interesting thing because it's like, I'm applying to schools and I'm applying to jobs, and then it becomes this thing where, you know, it comes out of love, but it's like my mom being like, you're gonna have to get a haircut if you want to like be taken seriously. So like things like that, where I'm like, now that I've kind of grown up and been caught up to speed in different ways about like the different influences and why I do things, whether that's because of like what's expected of Black men and the different pressures. Like now when I think about comments like that, I'm like, am I gonna cut my hair? Because like this is like, it's like such a symbol of pride now, that it's like trying to like counteract stereotypes and all that stuff. It becomes more of like a tug of war internally now, because you don't want to like fall victim to whatever pressures and systems, but at the same time there's a lot of competing interests. I don't know, it's kind of hard to put into words, but it's definitely been a journey. That's the summary of that question.
That's just a great summary to everything. It's been a journey.
Yeah, it's been a journey. That's it.
But yeah, it's funny because I was actually thinking about, you know, I did the same thing during the pandemic where I went through like 6 months or so, 7 months of just like growing out like a mini fro. I'd kind of pat it down a little bit, but it was just like, and then it just totally grew out my beard too. Like, just fun. And it felt like for a lot of other folks that I spoke to, yeah, it's interesting. Just even beyond Black women, like I was talking to a friend of mine, and she like even just dyed her hair like a completely different color, but she did it like on the back, so if she wanted to, or side, she could like kind of cover it up. So she's in a Zoom call, like you can't really tell she has like neon green hair, but then, you know, just after the call, she'll just kind of like shake it out, and there it is. So yeah, I think there's been something really empowering with the pandemic and allowing people to feel like they can remove like what Baldwin would call like the mask that everyone kind of has when they're out in the world. That's not their true selves. Because at the end of the day, you know, you're like staring to someone's bedroom. So like how, so like, you know, it's like almost impossible to have like this facade of like hyper professionalism if like you can kind of see the bed they sleep in every night, or whatever else it is. So I think that's been really like a really interesting part of the pandemic and this virtual world that we've all now had to exist in, because it's allowed us to also just be a bit more authentic, just whether you're Black or not. But in either case, yeah, I'm trying to think about like certain kind of behaviors or ways that I've done to kind of fit in or counteract social stereotypes. I think a big chunk of my identity when I was younger was trying to deliberately be like almost counter uh, like counter mass media Black culture, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like, like I enjoyed some of like the contemporary hip hop that was coming out at the time when I was a teenager, but I found a lot of joy in like listening to like Tribe Called Quest or De La Soul, like just folks who are like felt very different than kind of the typical masculinity that was on display. And I found a lot of solace and joy in listening to that and being a skateboarder. So like a big chunk of my identity when I was just a kid was like, okay, I'm gonna, I can't be tall, I can't do all. I'm gonna own kind of the opposite of what that was, and I don't know. I think it was okay. Like, I think I turned out all right, but that was. But as a result, I think I kind of missed out on maybe certain elements. Like for instance, I like deliberately wasn't as active in sports, even if I wanted to be. And so like I'm only really picking up basketball now, like as an adult. Like literally a cousin of mine who happens to live in Vancouver. Um, I'm like, yo, do you want to play basketball? And he's also kind of similar, like scrawny guy, really smart, was never really athletic. He's a doctor now, and yeah, so we're both like, yo, let's try to learn how to play basketball together, even though like grown ass dudes who are Black, and it's kind of embarrassing. It feels like,
Yeah.
we show up at a court and when we suck, like we are the worst players, like consistently. So like literally anyone else who isn't Black is much better. We'll be on the court and we'll try to pick an hour where there's not too many people around,
Yeah.
and a court that isn't as popular. But every once in a while we'll see like the one Black dude there who's like an amazing basketball player. But usually it's just like amazing Asian folks, whatever else it might be. So anyways, that's been something interesting of like this, this identity that I had of just trying to resist kind of like, the mass depictions of Black masculinity. It kind of, I never had the chance to really like pick up things that I actually enjoyed. Like, I don't know, I really enjoyed basketball, even though I suck at it. It's like super fun. So yeah, that's just a bit of an anecdote, I guess, from my experience.
Yeah, and I kind of relate to that too, in a sense, because I don't. Oh, am I on mute? No, I'm not on mute.
You're not.
I'm sure like you've gotten this too, Petros, but like a lot of times growing up, like I don't know if people meant this as a compliment. They'd be like, "Oh wow, you're really not like other Black guys," or you're like, and it just was like always such a weird, like I just never knew how to respond to that statement, and I got it in different forms, in different like ways, and like I'd say growing up too, I definitely have gravitated to like alternative like music than what is like put forth as what Black mainstream music of what we should be listening to. Like I said, like Frank Ocean, Steve Lacy's one that I really like. And I don't know, it's just been interesting too growing up. I guess I fell more in the mold of like the academic, like school focused kind of thing. And like you said, Petros, it's like in that way when you define yourself and you like, I guess I like got more comfortable in who I was in terms of like being more artistic. But then it's like I never really got to explore that side of being a little more athletic, because I do enjoy sports, but it's like once you learn like this isn't my thing, there is like a certain there's like a certain shame in trying it and not being exceptional.
That's a really good word, shame.
Yeah.
I mean? That's what all of this is premised on, of like if you aren't able to meet a certain kind of level of what is kind of depicted as masculinity, it's you are then collectively shamed and then potentially targeted,
Right.
right? To be on the receiving end of potential even more shame, or even at the other end, violence or bullying, whatever else it is.
And that's both like from other Black people and from
Yes,
non-Black people. So it's like you like, and even with what you said with the basketball court, I could already just like picture that. It's like me stepping on, and it's like I'm less than even like great, and it's just like, dang, what are you doing, man?
And by that being like it's basketball and its association with like Black masculinity is so potent that it's difficult to want to even try it, you know, unless you're amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like unless you're
like
amazing,
if you don't
like
start
don't
off
even
here,
show up.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, whereas that's not the case with like snowboarding, skateboarding, like just like other stuff. It's there are certain things where it's like you are expected to be excellent. And if not, don't even waste your time trying, or else you're better off just pretending you're a good basketball player. And there's been conversations where folks have been like, "Oh, you're a great basketball player," and I'm like, "Yeah, okay." I won't say shit.
Like I'll just let you.
I'll just take it. You know what I mean? But it's like it's restrictive in how you can kind of like operate in the world, and like and you know there are certain things where like you have to like hip hop music, right? Like there and fortunately for me, I do, and I think you know most of us do, but in either case, it's just there are certain rules where if you don't check off, it prevents you from being like your true authentic self, which then has its own symptoms of like, okay, you know, you're either like you know that there's all this damage that kind of goes with like not being your true authentic self. And then I think for Black folks, they have not only for Black men, there's a certain level of what masculinity is, and then being a Black male is too, and that can be damaging. So yeah.
And do you feel those kind of like rules and those stereotypes from like your own community? Because you both kind of touched on that a little bit. So do you want to expand on that?
Okay. Yeah, I feel like, and that's the thing, I do think that there are very specific ways in which like Black people ourselves like apply this pressure to each other. And it's not, and I feel like a lot of it, at least like over generations of like our experiences as Black people, I feel like a lot of it is probably like a trauma response. Like, for example, I think about the fact that a lot of conversations that I see in media that like within the Black community is like the threat to masculinity, right? So like, for example, like when what's his name, Lil Nas X like came out, and when he had a lot of, I guess, videos that were, it was kind of groundbreaking to see like a mainstream rapper, a gay Black man expressing himself the way he was. And I feel like a lot of the conversation was like, this is a threat to Black masculinity. This is emasculating the Black man. And I feel like a lot of that ties into like the history, right? I guess to Black men's masculinity has always been like under a magnifying glass and always like dissected, whether it's like saying like the stereotypes of Black dads not being there for the family, different things like that. And I feel like what ends up happening is like within the Black community, a lot of this is based, it's like a trauma response to like how dissected we like our identities have been, which is why we feel like there's really no room to mess up, or there's really no room to like veer off into different representations, if that makes sense. It's like, we got to be strong, we got to be this, we got to like in every way, we can't let them, whether it's like demasculate Black men or like different things. I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel that like like within the Black community, we apply the same pressures that have been applied to us to each other. But I feel like a lot of that is rooted in the fact that we haven't been allowed to, you know, back to our recent conversation, we haven't been allowed to be mediocre. We haven't been allowed to be a lot of things. And we've been given very like limited boundaries of what we can be. So then, I don't know, we're very, and this is obviously very like generally speaking, right? I can't like, this is a very like nuanced conversation, but I find that since we don't get much representations, I feel like when we get ones, like we're kind of easily threatened in a way, if that makes sense. I don't know how to describe that in words well, but I just find that sometimes I think that what it comes down to, actually, if I can put it into words, is that we apply the pressure, like, and even to ourselves, like, it's like you got to represent every Black person in like every movie, right? It's like you're checking off so many boxes, which is basically impossible. So it's like every movie carries the weight of representing Black people in a new light, and every new rapper carries the weight of representing Black masculinity in a way that, you know, is affirming to like an audience of Black people that really need that kind of representation. So it's almost just too much pressure, I guess, on each new Black representative, whether that's like in media, whether that's in politics. It's just a lot of pressure to represent a community that has had representations in the past that are very two-dimensional. So we just expect a lot out of other Black people. And I think that's why sometimes we apply that pressure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. It's very interesting. And just speaking from my own experience, I remember in high school, I very much rejected being like the Black girl, but like in grade 11 and 12, it was just like exhausting trying to reject that. So like I fully embraced it, you know, like I was that sassy Black girl who talked back, and like because that's what I felt like I had to be in order to be liked or to be related to, which obviously a lot to unpack there, you know, but I think that does go back to what you were talking about, Ian. Petros, do you have anything to add on this topic?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. It's yeah. A question for you, Emily. Did you primarily grew up in Alberta, or did you grow up partly abroad as well?
No, so I was born in Kenya, but I came here when I was 6. So I basically grew up
Ah, I
here
see.
most of my
Yeah,
life.
yeah,
Yeah. I
yeah.
have like
And then
very vague memories.
I see. And then Ian, so like you did high school in Canada as well.
Yeah, so I also came at a pretty young age, like I was 10. So yeah, a majority of my growing up, like adolescence, all that kind of stuff, was
Hmm.
in Edmonton. So
Yeah. Okay. Anyways, yeah. I don't even know where to start, to be honest with you. I think there's a couple of things. To answer your original question, yes, you absolutely experience a certain set of pressure from within your own Black community. But I'm also trying to situate, I'm also just trying to reflect about my own experience growing up in um, in Eritrea, in a predominantly Black place. And yeah, I think just I'm going to probably veer off topic a little bit. I think what's interesting for from my experience is just by virtue of how I grew up, I didn't have like as much of a fixation or kind of even realization of what it meant to be Black and the perceived boundaries or constraints associated, right? Like I because I think what happens often is, if you grow up um Black in a primarily like Western society, and you have the awareness of kind of elements of systemic racism, a potential consequence, I think, of that is, so like there's almost an ingrained sense of self-doubt sometimes. I don't know. There's like let me say it this way. I felt like when I came to Canada, I had a certain level of confidence and comfort in who I was as a Black person when I came here. In part because of just my own upbringing and not having to deal with, yeah, to deal all with all that comes of just being like a young Black male and growing up in North America. Um,
and
and so that
what age
I,
did you
I
come
was there from
here?
like 11 to like
Okay.
16 and a half. So I came halfway through grade 11, which is like a shitty time. And grade
Yeah.
11
Yeah.
is just such a, because I remember coming here and people were just taller and
Yeah.
bigger. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I'm like, I didn't, like, y'all look like adults.
Yeah.
You know, when you watch those movies and they have like grown ass actors trying to like
Playing high
Yeah.
schoolers.
playing
Yeah.
high school kids, that was
Yeah.
just like, that's what it was for me. I remember coming here and being like, oh my God, like, so I was actually really, my focus almost for a time was just dealing with the like if we're talking about Black masculinity, my focus and challenge is just reconcile the masculinity portion, because it's like,
Like
oh
the
my god,
physical, like
yeah, like
yeah.
everyone's just massive. I remember I had a close cousin of mine that we grew up with one another, and you know, like we kind of drifted apart. So when I came back, we happened to be in the same high school, but he was like on the basketball team and everything else, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like I was just, I just, and then if I think about the other males there at our school, yeah, there's, oh man, high school here is weird. It was just like, you know, you're either kind of like an athlete. I'm just trying to think like the archetypal males from my time is like athletes. There was a group of us, like the small group of us who were like nerds, you know, like they actually were trying to get by. There was like some of us that were also like the musicians, and then there's like dealers. That's kind of, that's just kind of it. Like especially where I grew up, like in the north side. Um, so yeah, anyways, that was interesting. That was kind of what I was really trying to reconcile with. But it was fascinating. I used the Black part as my identity as like almost it afforded me a bit of a shield, if you know what I mean. Because I could also, I remember, you know, like you're in a new high school, so there's always the fear, especially as a male, like you're getting targeted for violence and bullying. And I remember I was able to just use the Blackness as a shield of sorts, of just like walk around with a scowl, and people won't bug you for the most part, and it worked. And I remember like someone I remember even bumped into me at one point, and my general inclination would be like, yo, you good or whatnot, but it's so weird, I haven't talked about this memory in such a long time. I remember being like, I have to keep a straight face, and or you know,
like
so as
don't
to
let them
like,
see you weak, basically.
yeah, just being like disappointed, being like, man.
Yeah.
And because there was like an audience of folks, right? And it was like an innocuous moment, right? It wasn't much, but it's funny. I remember coming to school here, the kind of the Black part of my identity was like a shield by which I can kind of navigate and get by. And then university was just really the most enriching part for me. I mean, going to the U of A was just an amazing experience. Yeah, high school isn't easy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
high school sucked, honestly. And Petros, your story actually touches on my next question, which was going to be, I think there is a stereotype that Black men can't and aren't really allowed to be vulnerable, you know, like emotionally vulnerable, show their feelings. And so have you both felt like that? Like you can't really be vulnerable with what you're feeling, or you can't really share your emotions?
I feel like going back to what like Petros like put the starting off just basic definition of Black masculinity very well, in that it's literally just the intersection of, you know, being male and being Black. And I feel like just being a man in general, that that's just like a part of what the gendered societal norm is, right? Is that being super expressive or leaning to your emotions a lot is seen as weak. And then when you put like the Black experience into it, I feel like that also, it adds layers to it, right? Like speaking to like the fear in general of like Black men being like emasculated and just like always trying to put on that strong front. And I feel like it definitely is a pressure, and it's not normalized seeing like Black male role models and figures in like the public sphere. It's not normalized to see them like vulnerable, and we always want to see them strong. And it kind of goes back to like, I started to think of, especially when Emily, when you started to talk about like your experience here too as a Black woman, like I was also thinking about like, you know, as UASU, like VP Finance, like it's like you're going into uncharted territory and you're like representing a group of people, right? So it's like a lot of times I think for Black people in general and Black men, it's like we're still experiencing a lot of firsts in terms of representation. So I feel like that's part of also why we always want to put on a strong front. It's like there's so much work to be done and so much that we want to do to represent our communities, which once again is a lot of pressure, right? For one person to represent all like the nuances and experiences. So I feel like that's what it comes down to as well, in terms of like just being able to be human and to be vulnerable is that a lot of times there's a tall order of things that you want to check off and things that you want to accomplish. So I feel like that kind of gets left at the bottom of like the priority list, is like being vulnerable and just being yourself, basically, right? Like when we were talking about earlier in terms of like, you either got to be an amazing athlete or you got to be this. It's like this idea of being exceptional and feeling that pressure. And sometimes you get that pressure from your parents or from other people, and it's meant out of love, but it's like, they know how people perceive Black male, so they want you to go onto the world and give you the resources to be the best. But I think that leaves no room to be mediocre. That leaves no room to just kind of figure stuff out, to be vulnerable, to just kind of like take your time with things. And I think that's the more specific aspect to like when you add the Black to the Black experience to the like experience of being a man and like masculinity. Because when masculinity just by itself, like I think we all kind of understand the idea of toxic masculinity and the fact that it's just not normalized for men to be vulnerable. But
yeah.
Yep.
Plus one. So I know our time is running out, so I'll ask my very last question. So in your opinion, what do you want the experience of Black masculinity to look and feel like in the future? I know we kind of talked about the notion of Black masculinity evolving over the years, but like 10 years down the road, where do you kind of want us to be in terms of how we can broaden our ideas of Black masculinity?
Yeah, I struggle in trying to articulate what Black masculinity should be, because I think I take issue with, or I have a hard time trying to justify the need for masculinity or what that is. That being said, I do have a sense of what I hope future Black males feel like when they understand what Black masculinity is. Like, again, we kind of spoke about what we believe Black masculinity was during our childhood, and kind of what was modeled. I think in the future, what I would hope for is just continued diversity in terms of different ways that folks can kind of exist, different emotions that folks can express, different aptitudes, whether it's being like the remarkable basketball player, but also the remarkable student, or just even a mediocre student. I think, Ian, you brought up a good point that, or a blind spot of just, there is actually now like one of the models of Black masculinity is like a hyper focus on excellence. And I'm like, oh shit, like guilty as charged, right? In terms of my own fixation on Black excellence, right? At least on myself and kind of what I put on to others. And yeah, I think essentially what I hope for, let's say, if I have a kid or I have a son or whoever else it is, that what they understand Black masculinity to be at some point in the future is a myriad of different things, such that they don't necessarily feel like they're boxed in or pressed to a certain kind of mold, that they can just feel free to be whoever they are, which ideally is exhibiting positive behaviors and not toxic ones, right? At the end of the day. So
yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything Petros said. I was actually thinking of like, I don't know if you guys recently heard Bell Hooks, like the writer and just like huge figure in the Black community. She passed away, and I was kind of watching a video of hers where she talked about like the attack on Black masculinity in terms of like, I feel like a lot of times just the word masculinity itself, it evokes like our ideas of toxic masculinity, but we don't really separate that. Like we can like appreciate masculinity, but also take out the parts that are related to like the patriarchy and like being like misogyny and like homophobia and all these things like that. So I feel like, I guess moving forward, it'd be nice to like have conversations around that like nuance a little bit. It's like, the representation we have, there's no issues with like having rappers and like different kinds of people representing Black men. It's just we want more multitudes, you know what I mean? And just finding that nuance where we aren't really attacking hypermasculinity as long as it's not related to like, you know, misogyny, once again, homophobia, and like all these like more negative aspects, and just kind of, I don't know, enriching the experience and the representation of Black men so that in the future, like young Black boys that are growing up have a little bit more of a variety of representations and feel that they can just like exist rather than, you know, quickly try to like fit into a mold and kind of stick by that. And yeah, I don't know. I also just like when we talked about the pressure that a lot of people feel, I also just hope that like in the future, Black boys growing up don't feel the pressure, like don't feel that they have to carry the weight of a lot of things that have been passed down the generations, like representing and standing up for, like, once again, I go back to like last year, I feel like that was kind of a big defining moment for me personally with like how I like process my experience as a Black man and just like race in general. I feel like that period last summer where it was just like nonstop social media, everything was that was being depicted was like police brutality and all this other stuff. For me, who like really cares about those issues, I was like logged on like 24/7. But then after like a month of that, I just like was kind of like mentally checked out. So also just that aspect of just being allowed to exist and not feeling that pressure to like always be a spokesperson, always be this, like you also just have to be human at the end of the day. And I hope that like Black boys in the future and just Black people in general, that like I hope that they don't have that same like feeling that they have to always push the conversation, have to always be consuming these things that a lot of times really like, I don't know, they're very draining and they're emotionally exhausting. So yeah, I just hope that people are allowed to exist a little more just as they are in the future.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to end our conversation. So thanks, Petros and Ian, for joining me today and sharing your perspectives and ideas. I really appreciate it. So yeah, that's the end of our conversation.